Hello and welcome back to part two of these videos that I wanted to create in response to this rampant atheism that's being promoted by some brilliant intellectual people and some as I said in video one, I'm getting concerned about the fact that the baby is being thrown out with the bathwater, and that there's an awful lot of debate as to whether there is a separate God. And I personally don't believe in a separate God, but I do believe in the inherent divinity of all things. I guess by my technical definition is I'm a pantheist. But what I see in the debate is that there's this one thing or the other, and I'm definitely not in the camp of believing in an imaginary friend, some bearded divine being that has control, or this kind of capricious running of the show here. It just doesn't fit with my experience. I was brought up as a devout atheist and then had an experience of a sense of interconnection with all things, where for a moment I experienced what it was like to be me without fear. And in that moment I had such clarity that I realized fear has caused an awful lot of problems in my life, and I wanted to then try and work out how I could live so that there was less fear in my system. When I studied how to do that, what I found myself studying was the ancient spiritual texts. Now, this was uncomfortable for me because I'm not a spiritual person. I didn't like to think of myself in that way. I thought my father would be most concerned, having done his best to bring me up as a very devout atheist. Not in a mean way. He did it with humour, which was incredibly effective. We'd go to churches and he'd go, "Oh, I'm getting a bit itchy. I think I'm allergic to these places," and kind of wink at me. And I felt awfully sorry for anyone that needed to believe in some kind of separate God. I don't now, because I understand that these are cultural attempts, ancient cultural attempts, to try and understand what is essentially what it is to live without fear. Now, I get that the organized religion is now hugely involved in promoting practices that increase fear and increase doubt and increase judgment. But that's not the reason to throw out what it is, the practice of endeavoring to live in integrity and to live beyond fear. And whilst some atheists out there were saying, well, we're not saying that, we're not saying dismiss that, we're into good human values and the beauty of humanity. But for me, whatever practice you use to focus on being a good person, that's what spirituality is. I know it's been hijacked, and I don't like that term either. But its root term, spire, the root of the word spirituality is the same root as respiration. It's life force. It's the primary energy. It's the same root as inspiration. When someone's inspired, they're full of life. It's like, that's what I want. That's what my spirituality is. That's what my faith is. That's what my interest in is. How do I live here and be inspired? And by inspired, I mean my eyes are wide open. I'm enthusiastic. Even the word enthusiasm comes from the Greek entheos. It means to have God within. And when I'm talking to a fanatic about their stamps or music, or when they're lit up, I want that. I want my life to be full of passion and excitement. I don't need to believe in a separate God to get that. And I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is all of that chat, all of the ancient scriptures, all of that was never about that. It was just trying to communicate in ways, using metaphors that people might understand these kind of core psychological principles. For instance, I remember, despite my father's best attempts, I still did have some. I was brought up in a Church of England school, and there was a lot of indoctrination, and there was lots of religious process, and I remember though, when I was 7, I was at the West House School in Edgbaston in Birmingham, and I remember there was a sermon, and the person, I guess the vicar or whatever, or the teacher, was telling the story of Jesus in the desert. And as the story went, Jesus was in the desert and the devil approached him. I'm thinking red tail, horns, three-pronged spear. Was that Neptune? I get confused. Anyway, right? So I'm there at 7 thinking about this, and I'm just not buying it. It just sounds stupid. It just doesn't sound believable. It sounds like a story. It sounds fantastical, supernatural, and therefore nonsense. And I dismissed it as such. I remember it vividly. I can still picture it in my mind. Yet with that, I lost something. I feel pretty certain that if someone had explained to me when I was 7 that Jesus, in a moment of introspection, and whether he actually went out into the desert for 40 days or whether that's where he spent the time in his life between 13 and 30, probably apparently with the Essenes community in the Sinai desert, very interesting bunch of people. Whether it was 40 days or 20 years or what have you, it doesn't matter. For me, I think that's just a metaphor for introspection. In a moment of introspection, he didn't meet the devil. He was reconciling his ego. He was aware that his ego, if unchecked, would lead him through greed and fear to behave in ways where he might try and control, amass wealth, manipulate, do all sorts of things that would just mess everything up, wouldn't make him happy. And it was his balancing the fact that he was aware he was a powerful person, and it could go one of two ways for him. That is the spiritual journey. That's what it's all about. Who we are and how we are. And this is where it gets confusing, is when it gets to talking about the God stuff. But when I tried to understand this, my experience, my own personal epiphany was a sense of immense interconnection and oneness. And I was flooded with such bliss. And trust me, I had been looking for bliss. I'd been taking things to give me bliss. I had been a hedonist, and I had been doing everything I could to be happy. And I was a lot happier than most people I knew. But this happiness was totally different. I felt completely lined up. I felt like I understood everything. But I didn't understand what had just happened. I had no context. I'm sure if I'd been brought up a religious person, I would have defined that as a religious experience. I didn't. When I started to try and tell my friends about it, I heard from other friends that I'd found God, which was preposterous. I was still an atheist. But it was when I discovered subatomic physics that I really came to understand that what I'd connected to, what I'd perceived, or what I'd experienced was really the truth of our reality. Our physical reality is extraordinary. We're made up of 1,000 trillion atoms, and those atoms are so infinitesimally small. Sorry, it's tricky to say. And yet within those atoms, they're mainly space, a massive wide expanse of space in which light is spinning around a nucleus, electrons spinning around a nucleus at the speed of light. So what seems solid, our sensory perception of reality, is not accurate. And what is true of our reality is that there is this, everything is made up of this spinning light. Everything is that. And what they've discovered is when you open up that atom, there are properties in there which are extraordinary. Where if you split a photon and send it down a track 7 miles apart, and at the end of that track, there's millions of options for it to go left or right. And yet that photon, once split, this is called quantum entanglement, will take the same journey through a maze where it could go either way 1,000 times, every single time at exactly the same moment. Both of those aspects of that split photon will behave in exactly the same way. And all of the known universe was once compacted into something that would fit in the palm of my hand. All of it. In other words, what you're looking at, wherever you are, wherever you're watching this, you and I have once, 13.7 billion years ago, before we were exploded amongst with all this space and light, we were less than a centimetre away from each other, or an inch away from each other. Everything compacted, everything extra close. And so that sense of oneness that I felt was accurate. And so if photons feel connected, even though they're seemingly separate. And everything was once compounded and compacted, and yet all the way through it is just light. And this light, therefore, there's a form of communication that they've proven which isn't mechanical. It's not one thing happens over here, and then if you change that here, then the change occurs here mechanically. It's instantaneous across vast distances. Well, this is hard to grasp, but this is a scientific definition of light being in all things, it having a form of intelligence whereby which there's a form of balance to it. Science is starting to ratify this idea of omnipresence and omniscience. As in, God is all things and everything. And you don't have to call it God, you can call it light. And when I discovered this, I thought this was fascinating. So I thought, well, hold on. If I just, instead of using the word God, because I was still uncomfortable with it, and I just used the word light, then every time I read a spiritual scripture, I could just replace the word and see if it worked grammatically. And I opened the Bible, and the first thing I saw was let there be light, for the beginning of creation. In other words, everything is just light. Light and vibration, electromagnetic energy. And all the terminology. And so this is pretty exciting news. I got really excited, and also explained why when I felt that, I realized that all the talk about the afterlife and everlasting life and all that stuff, which I don't believe there's a heaven that we go to. And I believe when we get that we are part of this universal cosmos, and our atoms have been in many different forms before and will be in many different forms, it's not everlasting life for the personal being, it's the oneness field in which we've been expressed millions of times. It's like take a massive body of water and chuck in 7 billion human-shaped ice cubes, and then trillions of insect-shaped ice cubes, and it just all the different matter. But really, it's just one substance. It's one fluid, ever-moving, ever-changing things. We have been in many, many, many different forms, and the exciting thing is that means there isn't a separate God. It means you are God. But don't get too excited, so's the carpet. It's gloriously mundane and perfectly wondrous. And you don't need to call it God. You can call it physics or quanta, or you can allow this just to drive your humanity. But what's important is having a practice of understanding that we are not who we think we are in that sense. We're expressed in this way, and we've come to think of ourselves as our name and as our body, as our age, and we can live a whole life like that. But if we do, we're more likely to be territorial, we're more likely to be jealous, we're more likely to be egotistical, we're more likely to want to amass wealth, and it makes life harder. If we can transcend that and rest in a slightly more universal kind of identity, then we're more likely to be collaborative, we're more likely to care about the environment, we're more likely to care about people that are outside of our family. And this isn't about believing in God, this is about understanding the true nature of reality. That part of our heart that does care, that does want to be that generous soul. It's not about some heaven that we go to, it's about heaven now. Right here, we could take a moment to just drop out of that aspect of ourselves that's afraid. And if we could drop the level of fear, which most people aren't aware, it's in operation all the time. It's there. You know, if you're asked to stand up and sing a song in front of a bunch of people you didn't know, or take your clothes off, or do some mental arithmetic with an audience, people get really scared around that stuff. They get really frightened. But we have politeness. We just walk around, we shake hands, we keep it simple. It's like, I'm terrified, but you're terrified. Let's be polite. So neither of us need to notice that we're terrified, right? And if you're thinking, I don't have fear, but you think you have stress, you know, stress is like the modern term for terror. It's like anxiety. We can be stressed. I wouldn't want to say I'm afraid, but I do get stressed. It's just another word for fear. And whatever helps you transcend that. I don't mean needing to believe in some imaginary being that's looking after you, is going to reward you, or be good now and you get to go to heaven. It's like all of that for me is a corruption of a simpler idea. But it drives me crazy that these atheists are dismissing the the idea of a separate God, and also throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But there is a whole range of practices that enable you to rest, identify more with the light in your atomic structure, which is real. Okay, that is energy and it's real. I'm not being a crystal hippie around that. That's the true nature of our reality. And if I can take 10 minutes out of my day to get mindful and bring my attention from the top of my head to the center of my chest, I feel more peaceful. I feel more relaxed. You know, I believe that if my time was up, my time would be up. My attitude to death, my attitude to life, all of this is enriched by a more universal perspective and less of a personal one, less of an egotistical one. And there's a lot of this writing, there's a lot of this kind of writing that the spiritual person can bless themselves. Like there's a, like you'll be protected by God, if you will. And for me, it's more practical than that. And it's a confusion which causes a lot of trouble. There is a blessedness that comes from being free of fear. You see, this world is set up almost like a complicated stress test where the universe is looking for good design. A species surviving, survival of the fittest. This is an outcropping of that kind of thinking, where I could take you to any playground and we could sit down and look at the kids that are confident and look at the kids that aren't, and we could see just by the interactions of the playground. We could do this in any nightclub. And people who are afraid don't attract, and they get picked on, they get attacked. I mean, in the animal world, the runt gets eaten. On one level, it's one way of keeping the gene pool strong. In another perspective, it's a way of looking for really well-designed, good design. Like if we're well-designed, we'll be peaceful. If we're peaceful, we'll thrive. We'll be attractive. We'll have more kids. There's a simplicity to it. But for me, one thing that helps me feel more peaceful is really understanding this principle around oneness, this pantheism for me, seeing everything as an expression of this light, which is perfectly balanced in everything. It's a definition of omnipresence and omniscience, but without any beards, right? When I focus on that, I understand that enables me to be who I could be and can be. So in these ancient spiritual texts, and this is in the Tao Te Ching, and which is a Chinese spiritual text, and in lots of the Hindu Vedantas, there's these stories of these wise sages that can walk through the jungle and they won't be gored by the tiger, or they won't be attacked by the rhinoceros, or there are all sorts of stories of kind of Native American kind of chiefs who are kind of like relaxed whilst they're surrounded by rattlesnakes, and we see it in various films. But if we were really connected to this principle of oneness, if we really got that deeply, and we were as identified with the floor and the water and the tree and the forest, if we felt as much those things as ourselves as the embodiment, well, if we were in the jungle and a lion happened upon us, the ultimate, I think, of this form of enlightenment, of completely being at peace with everything that occurred, being totally at peace with death, because you wouldn't really perceive death. You would just imagine that you're a part of an atomic structure. You wouldn't be identified with your personality. Well, if a lion happened upon you and chose to eat you, you would, in an ideal place, you would be as identified with the lion. So whilst being eaten, if you were totally enlightened, you would be pleased that you, as the lion, were having a good lunch. Now, I get it. That's a stretch, right? That's a stretch for most people. It would be a stretch for me. But what's really interesting is if you could be at peace with being eaten, like if you really could be relaxed about that, the lion wouldn't eat you. The lion would not see you as food. And we see this with dogs, like don't show them fear. It's like same with bears, don't run. Anytime, if you can control your adrenaline release, that adrenaline release is like literally like a sign above you saying, I'm food. I'm either going to attack you or run away from you. It's a signal. It's not magic, it's not metaphysics, it's probably pheromonal, and it's a scent, and it's perceivable, and everything's operating on that basis. If we come from fear, if we come from ego, if we come from the need to amass, if we come from greed, we will not be happy, we will not be content, we will not be as attractive, we will suffer. And spirituality is just about waking up to the fact that our ego is mental, and it's doing its best to help, but But grounding ourselves, being overly identified with our personality, is going to lead to the destruction of the earth and the corruption of our relationships, and nothing's going to work well. We might have success. We might think, well, hold on, there's loads of people who have made loads of money and lots of people find them attractive. But if you were to interview their heart, it wouldn't be a real good, lasting happiness. Trust me, most of my clients, I work with people who have got lots and are not happy. And there's a reason why people are taking 400% more antidepressants than they were 10 years ago. The system isn't working as a happiness delivery system. And this idea that you get rid of religion and then you'll feel a lot happier, that is true if you're terrified of a paternalistic, judgmental God. Get it. More power to your elbow, atheists, for dismissing those ideas. I get it. But that's not the only answer. That's not the only solution. But to dismiss the whole world of spirituality on the basis that some people, lots, I get it, and lots of people in significant power choose to use a metaphor which is defined by this external, controlling, supernatural authority. I get it. But that's not what it's about. And if you read the esoteric texts, the Sufism, the Tao Te Ching, the early Christian mystics, none of them are talking about that. What they're talking about is not being an idiot and being free. And philosophy, philosophy, is the love of wisdom. It's the study of what is it to live in a wise way. In other words, what will make us happy? What will work as a society? And from where I am, spirituality is whatever practice you use to bring that wisdom to life, to bring your love to life, to bring your happiness to life. And I think that's worth protecting. And I think that is actually the only thing that enables us to find real peace. And therefore I respect all models that people use, all metaphors that people use, that give them a chance to relax, give them a chance to come back to their center. And I don't mean because they have some false hope of some heaven that they're going to, but because they have a daily practice of reminding themselves that in every single moment they have a choice to come from love or fear. And I believe all the great seers and all the great prophets from all the great faiths, that's all that they were really trying to do. They may have used metaphors that have been twisted now and confused by those that have followed. But that's not a reason to throw the whole lot out. In fact, if we did, the world would slide even more horribly into a world of excessive materialism and confused principles. And so, yeah. Thank you.